This real side experience would begin with a scene of an almighty skirmish. I wouldn't be merely observing from a side the created, simulated scene, as can be an option provided via a real awareness that is part of this isness. Everything is through all consciousness and the ideas it comprises of, therefore, and so the real awareness can show the personal self anything of what is transpiring in creation, a little like having our own movie theatre, but in this case I would be directly involved with what was transpiring. Evidently then this was a necessity, for as we observe from our real awareness positions, from the cinema seat, we are unable to engage with the participants, or to attempt to effect alterations to what is taking place, if we seek to share the ears and are to be deployed in various assisting of others' capacities, etc. For Duane has mentioned, as by our very presence, with others involved in our experience, even abrasively, will they have the opportunity to consider that which they never have before, what with us operating in ways generally is referencing and life beneficial. The scene I would find myself interjected into would comprise of a battle between two sides. It surely had a very sci-fi flavour to it, considering the sophistication of the weaponry, armour, and technology being utilised. This battle was taking place in a kind of metallic, equally as a technologically orientated enclosure. It was rather a mismatched affair at first. The group I was with were but a handful, and those that stood as opposition comprised of a small army and boasted the far greater array of technology and weaponry in relation to ours. It seemed all involved were resigned to the confines of this particular metallic overall scene, as though progression was possible, but couldn't be so absent of the battle reaching a decisive outcome. My group and I were pinned down by the laser fire from the opposing army, to the point where it might seem that all would surely be lost. However, when we lean to the real awareness, when we step from the personal self and the limitations the consciousness presents as on the real side, the real awareness is somewhat limitless in how it can operate the simulated self in the creational, real side interjected situations, assuming the personal self clings to no unaddressed ideas of restriction which will serve to hamper the real awareness's effectiveness. As an example, through the real awareness, we can deal with all and any individual on the real side should they choose to assail us. But should the personal self hold to the agreement of a certain individual as having a power over us, this presents as potential simulation where this can be so, and the real awareness cannot override what is a free will being decided by the personal self. Such an individual, then, we will be unable to handle, unless we swiftly determine the agreement and release it on the spot, which can happen also. And so, in this case, despite the seeming odds stacked against my group and I, we were able to evade all that was thrown at us, and indeed we presented a distraction of a kind that I don't quite recall, that served to misdirect their fire, and allowed us to capture one of their various outposts that were scattered in this technological metallic enclosure. As such, we were able to turn their technology against them, and they would retreat hastily, realizing that not only were the group and I apparently immune to their efforts, but their tech and weaponry had fallen into our hands, and they did not share our immunity. The whole affair could be construed as the exchange of ideas, and due to the level of sophistication of the projectiles, the ideas employed, this hinted at the nature of the ideas being exchanged, that of a more sci-fi orientated persuasion. And so, as we rather ran into the dark forces here, they may have been instigating actual conflict, or again, an exchange of ideas. That they were unable to hit us, indicative of agreement they were unable to glean from the group and I, and that they retreated from our return fire, suggested ideas they were then unwilling to even acknowledge, let alone accept. The scene switched. The same group and myself were now stationed in the supermarket that I work. The supermarket itself rather irrelevant, just a simulated overlap from what has claimed my focus, due to my physical level working shifts, as I have described before. But what occurs within it is what I am to be paying attention to. For one of the walls that the supermarket comprises of would be absent, and as though connected to a tranquil, natural environment that extended as far as was visible, indicating that this simulated idea I had effectively manifested on the real side, the supermarket backdrop, is very insubstantial, unless I hold to the idea of it, which I would not, and so these physical level recreated infringements tend to be temporary and simply woven into the real side experience, and the natural environment is representing of the true reality throughout creation, as the ears operates through it, absent of the presence of a secondary personal self, which would overlay this true position standing with the filters of a created unreality. And now, from this natural scene would be floating 3 individuals, as though levitating in a cross-legged position, 3 men wearing robes. They would float toward us and come to a stop at the threshold between where the environment they were in ended and the supermarket overlay began. My impressions suggested they either were real guides or other beings who possessed recognition of the ears, and perhaps then the representation was of them operating in the real universes, the natural environment, where my group and I still had much to do in regards to releasing agreement and attachments that until we did had us resigned to a creation represented by the supermarket. Regardless, the beings would speak with us, and that by their estimation we were progressing well with our respective awareness processes. However, they also would issue a warning that the dark forces will be turning up the heat, so to say, and to expect much by way of attempted attacks and interference on the real side. And indeed, before they departed, they would inform us the dark forces were coming for us now, during this very real side experience. The environment scene faded along with the three beings. The wall of the supermarket re-established itself, but the supermarket now was far vaster in size, as though having been expanded somewhat. If a building can represent a consciousness, oftentimes larger buildings represent collective consciousnesses of all those present within it, or perhaps indicating the individual has a far greater compaction of idea agreements and attachments to deal with, and a larger building required then to accommodate it all. In this case, the enlarged building perhaps more indicative of the dark forces that were on the verge of manifesting. The shared group consciousness representing a building now made far larger to accommodate the influx of the consciousnesses of the dark forces soon to arrive, they having far more by way of idea agreements to address, should they indeed decide to do so. For naturally, as you involve yourself in the affairs of others on a massive, multi-dimensional scale, you are taking on far more karma ideas than those whose choices and actions are more limited and less far-reaching. But prior to the arrival of these dark forces, Duane would suddenly manifest in our midst. He would provide us each with a pair of shoes seemingly. It was essential we put them on, that this would assist in the situation that was to come. As footwear indicates the creational physical level, it suggested something we needed in addition, but from a physical, personal perspective. Perhaps a certain alignment to the personal intent, an adjustment that would facilitate better a process of awareness which demands a continuous addressing of the personal self, the releasing of outdated ideas, attitudes, etc. For indeed, one of the shoes was ill-fitting, as I struggled to even put it on, due to it comprising of a cardboard with laces attached, that I had to then wrap around my foot, unlike the other shoe which fit perfectly. Or perhaps that was the idea, to release more the literal personal side that the shoes represented, that it was maybe a test. We were provided shoes if we wanted them, but ideally we ought to abandon them, and shoes that once fit well we are effectively outgrowing, or that they no longer are viable as we continue our process of awareness and rather dissociate ever more from the personal self, and simply use the mechanics for what we do in creation to effect that which is beneficial. For then we are still operating in creation on the physical side, and the idea is to bring what we recognize from the real side and share it, so the saying of keeping your feet on the ground may apply in actuality as another view. We ought have our shoes ready for when we require them. The ill-fitting shoe also was full of little pebbles that I had to empty onto the floor. Duane would speak to me directly. He would warn me that my consciousness had a certain idea, proclivity, or pattern of behavior to it that, given the right set of circumstances, can flare up and impact my experience, that being self-sabotage, and that he advised I pay special attention to this particular created aspect of my consciousness, especially now as I go about my awareness process. This suggested then the reason for the footwear issue, all other viewpoints aside, that of the potentiality of self-sabotage from a physical level perspective, that I may be drawn to making poor decisions, and must recognize when a certain motivation for such rears its self-limiting head. And then, bursting into the scene, would be the dark forces, taking the form of slobbering, beast-like hounds. As I said earlier, we can deal with any situation, or dark force, or ill-intended assailant, providing we have no agreements extended to them that allow them to harm us. In the event that such agreements are present, unless we can release these agreements on the spur of the moment, retreat is advisable. Quite clearly, a certain group of the dark forces were deployed where these agreements were determined to be lacking, to ensure their likelihood of success. We fled from the wolf-like creatures, accompanied by Duane, though he wasn't in any peril, as impressions suggested. One of the group would fall to the beasts and be devoured, suggesting the possibility that he was somewhat drawn and influenced by the dark forces, but nothing that can't be addressed at a later time, if he so chose. We are not resigned to our agreements unless we decide to be. That although the group and I were susceptible to these particular dark forces through as yet unreleased agreements, our overall intent remained steadfast with the ears, and so we ensured we also would not be devoured. One of the members of my group, a female I could not personally identify, but was an individual that impressions revealed had been working with me on the real side for a very lengthy period of illusory time, that spanned in fact many lifetimes, as though, despite our various lifetimes, where we would have had little interest or recognition of our real awareness, we were still being nudged along in that direction, our real awareness evidently deciding the process of his recognition to begin, but the personal self as yet to be made aware of it, until recently in this lifetime. She was rather a sulky, attitude-driven person, but regardless, she was still on her process also, although rather tiresome could she be with how she conducted herself. Never mind the cup being half empty, at times with her there wasn't even a cup involved in the equation. The group and I had successfully evaded the dark force hellhounds, but for one, as I said, and now the scene switched from the expanded supermarket to a kind of technological base. It was as though we had missed the view of several scenes preceding this, as we had apparently captured a very highly ranked dark force character. Real awareness impressions would fill in the blanks. That overall, the group and I had raided a dark force military facility for the purposes of securing this one key and very influential dark force asset. I'm uncertain as to exactly why we had done this, but the individual himself was a monster of a man, heavy-set, gargantuan in his proportions. He wore a very expensive suit that barely accommodated his mass. He must have stood 8 feet tall in addition, and we had him restrained on the ground, his ankles and wrists bound. He absolutely reeked, an odour so bad that having one's nose surgically removed at that moment would have been a tempting proposition. He would be crying, begging, and slobbering, but as we disregarded his pleas for release, we would communicate with others through the technology present in the room we were barricaded within that we had secured the target and were ready for extraction. The idea seemed that extraction would be made possible by virtue of the ceiling being absent, in that it was open to the skies, where craft could enter and afford us our exit from the dark force building. As I said, we had secured the room, we had the target, but we were somewhat trapped also, the various military hammering on the sealed entrances, etc. But it seemed the dark forces had an alternative option, so adamant were they that we do not sequester the huge dark force asset away. They were prepared to kill him, as opposed to letting us complete our assignment. For instead of a transportation arriving for our extraction, a dark force military craft would come into view. It was dark, sinister, very sophisticated to the extent that in actuality it was very likely a dark force alien spacecraft, with the singular objective of destroying us and the asset we were trying to secure. What happened next was curious, at least visually. That our rescue from this dire situation and our successful kidnapping of the dark force asset was made possible by the presence of a large white snake. The snake didn't even appear to do much. It was simply there, and its length was also revealed and impressed upon my personal self. Perhaps then a significance in the number given, that of 21 feet. My impressions were that it was a very powerful dark force being, assuming this form, that of a white python, but had literally switched sides in that very moment, electing to walk away from the dark forces where it wielded much influence, to step up instead and assist the real guides in whatever way was required. Quite clearly a reptilian, hence its snake form of some standing, and although nothing simulated took place, as I said, the previous scene was resolved. We were extracted, the prisoner secured for whatever purpose that served, but it all happened while our focus was on this large snake being, and we would remain in this scene, in the presence of this snake. It would suddenly alter its form into that of a large arachnid, like an oversized tarantula, not just for displaying its shape-shifting capability, but for assisting us further in fact. For it would crawl upon each of us in turn, it would sit on our chests, and this would cause us to regurgitate suddenly and violently. What we produced were parts of another tarantula, though much smaller. I could determine the segmented parts, the large protruding fangs in what I expelled. My impressions were that we each had an unconscious agreement with a certain entity-type being that presented itself in a spider form, as can be often the case with entities as I have shared. This agreement had us, to an extent, under this entity's control, though less for those who are detaching from consciousness agreement, where this control would have been previously possible and more potent. And it was as though the snake, the reptilian, had assumed a similar form to the entity, as though establishing a connection with it by doing so, and had been instrumental in ridding us from the vague influence the entity had been still able to exact over us, a complete releasing of agreement with the entity, represented here as we regurgitated the spider remains. Really, we must decide the agreements we hold to, or those we release, but there are certainly beings that are capable of assisting us with teasing these tap lines from us as we so choose to remove them. The real guides, Duane, and beings of a certain level of awareness are able to do this, as I have been shown and shared on the real side, and certain powerful creational-based beings, even absent of much by way of awareness or recognition of their real awareness states, if they have developed their consciousness with such ability, can have the skill to also make what are effectively alterations to the consciousness of others. And this was a service this stepping up powerful reptilian was willing to provide seemingly, along with our extraction from the previous situation. Although I had the impression we could have easily escaped the impending destruction wrought by the military craft ourselves, but we were as though giving this snake being the opportunity to assist us, to get involved also, etc. For the guides could, as an example, do everything themselves, but they rather give us the opportunity to take on certain assignments, that we become more aware and capable by doing so, and this was a similar situation, as though we were providing an opening for the stepping up snake reptilian to choose to assist, and from there he was then willing to help us also with the entity, etc. The idea of all those becoming more aware, assisting and supporting each other, very demonstrable here, and there the experience would end.
Beyond terrific, Kevin. Yes, very, very important. I'm actually going to do a group here about you and your experiences again, and relate this to people, because the information is very, very valuable. It helps me here too, because by the very fact that you're going through this and you explain it so well, it creates very good objective views, and I see how it works through the consciousness and the awareness of each person if they pay attention and accept it accordingly and recognize it for what it's doing. It's very, very important, because it's pinpointed on, the adventure that we have in life, because it's a big adventure. And it's actually a romantic adventure. It's a love affair with all life, as the person begins to recognize this, and the challenge, yes, to meet the challenge, to face it. This is what has to be done. And as each person does it, well, everything becomes more real and better. Now, that part where this is very important, that part where they're shooting lasers at you. Okay, so this is the energy that exists in creation. So what they've learned to do, like through technology, is to be able to focus that, just like in Star Wars where they had the death ray and they blew up the planet, etc. So they're able to focus that energy, and you might say aim it at you, but at the same time as you have the awareness to simply, recognize what they're doing, you can simply give it back to them. And this is the interesting part. And, maybe like in a James Bond film, because James likes to joke around a little bit, he'd say, oh, did you lose something? Is this yours? And as he simply gives it back to them, you see? So it's not a matter of resisting it, and it's not a matter of wanting to destroy them or get rid of them. No, that's not the idea. None of that. It's simply that, hey, they created it. This is yours. And so you're just simply giving it back to them. So as we become attacked and what have you, this is what people need to understand is that all that energy that's thrown at us that creates fear and emotion and whatever, well, that goes back to the sender. That's real. And the boys will use this like a debt. So this is what people don't understand, and that is that they don't have to be afraid, because those that are projecting this, anything like that, to harm others or violence or whatever, they are more afraid. And they're just projecting their own fear. So it's an understanding, isn't it? So it's like a bratty child. The parents eventually get the idea of what the child is doing, and they're okay with it. And so the child has created its own frustrations because it doesn't know certain things or wants certain things or whatever. And we all go through this, and it's all okay. And the real guides understand this with us too. I have this personal self. It's not perfect. I'm not trying to be perfect here. That's not the idea. People have said in the past, when I taught years ago, they thought that, oh, you're like a perfectionist. Well, no, that's not the idea. The idea is that I'm just trying to, get through this myself and understand it, and at the same time provide my viewpoint and what I know, etc. That's it. It's not about me. We're all trying to discover what life is, but while we're in creation, we have to go through this process because this helps us become more aware. And just listening to how you presented this, Kevin, is great. And I saw it within my own awareness, because it's endless, that all of a sudden it picks up these experiences, and it automatically, I've set myself up, it automatically evaluates them according to become more aware of what I'm not aware of. This is how the process works, and this is how the real guides do it, but it's something unseen that you have to recognize, and eventually it encompasses everything. This is what's so cool about it. So yes, the shoes that were there in the experience, they relate to a particular, and you decide how you see that, because in this realm here, we have the two sides. We have the literal and we have the creative side. So you're showing right now, you're presenting your creative side. And yes, you have that strong literal side, and that's okay too. So again, little by little, just like a tree growing, the understanding comes. And this is where I tell people, they think that just because they start taking in the information, because that's what it is first. What is presented is first information. That's all it can be. And then it becomes a knowledge. Once it's recognized for its value, it goes through a process too, and each one of us do. But many people make the mistake of thinking that, oh, okay, I know what this is about. I know what he's doing, so I'm just going to go off and look for something else, or, eat or drink orange juice all day and sit cross-legged and be with the flowers, whatever. Okay, fine, go do it. But that has nothing to do with confronting what's taking place in creation, because all of creation is for the number one purpose of each one of us becoming more aware. And so again, as people don't want to know, well, they're not going to know. But until they do, they're not going to become more aware of what all life is. And that's the big picture, the endlessness of what life is, the isness, to be able to even get the hints to see what this is about, because it's not anything that you can consider. So this is the new now, and this is just how it is. This is just how it is. This is what I see. This is my part, like you have your part, whatever, and we all contribute. But it's very, very valuable here because we all need help in the physical. We all need help through creation, etc. Each one of us to do what we're doing. And that's why I'm doing what I'm doing, because it's my romantic adventure. It's my love affair with life. And love to hear people like you that step up and have the courage to face it. And so again, yes, we call these attacks, but as we become more aware and understand what's going on, we can just let it pass through, you might say. In other words, just give it back to the sender. It's like, look, this is yours, and you can let them know at the same time, hey, you can do better. You don't need this. And first of all, let them know, face up, you don't have to be afraid anymore, because all these world controllers, all the Kalam God and all that, they're all afraid. They use the defensiveness of the power idea because they have followers and that's their power, and it's a false power. They misuse these individuals and keep them unaware when these individuals could realistically support them with a real awareness to where everyone has whatever they want, which they really want is to become aware and free of the restrictions. So the world controllers have the most restriction. Even though it looks like others are restricted, they are more restricted. Look at their body types. It's self-evident. It shows up. They are more restricted than the humans are, but the humans are thinking that they're more restricted, which they're really not. It's just that they've been literalized according to the invented systems, and they have to struggle with that restriction. So, but it's all okay, because now you know that you can get through it. And if it takes 50, 100 years, 1,000 years, no time limit, no time limit at all, thinking this or this should happen. Learn to see what all life is. But what you're doing here, Kevin, is just terrific. Thank you so much.
And so, sing the new you song. It is your connection to the true reality, the all is, that the real you, your real awareness, is a part of. New